Wow, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you all for coming. I'm blown away with the crowd, and this is great. So whatever you guys are doing here is the right thing. Um, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about my influence as a writer. I'm going to talk about something called flash fiction, and a little bit about experimental writing. And then I think I'll talk a little bit about being a younger writer. I didn't know I was the youngest, so I guess I'll capitalize on that and talk about just getting started as a writer, because I imagine some of you are interested in that. So I grew up in Tucson, Arizona. My father is a computer engineer. My mother was an artist, and now she works at the YMCA. They have, needless to say, an awesome bookshelf. It has really thick computer engineering texts that I drew in as a child, and really awesome art books that I drew in as a child. And then there was a small selection of really thin books that when I was young and growing up I was really interested in, because they weren't 800 pages. So I naturally gravitated towards whatever was on that shelf, which happened to be Richard Brautigan and Kurt Vonnegut and Salinger, an old copy of Animal Farm. And so I got this kind of hodgepodge of experimental and humor and satire when I was when I was definitely too young to really understand it. It was some of my first stuff. As I was reading, Nancy Drew and the Babysitter's Club, and Little House on the Prairie is a good one. Lots of heads. And so that was kind of a funny introduction to reading. I think that everyone has a similar hodgepodge of things. Shirley Jackson was really important to me growing up. This kind of mystery writer and a woman writer that was fascinating to me. As I continued reading, and I went to Arizona State, I got my English literature degree. So I got into the classics. I read, Raymond Carver and Barry Hannah, and I read Hemingway and Faulkner, and teaching at Arizona State was Ron Carlson, who is a fantastic short story writer. If you haven't read him, is very good. And he was one of my teachers for an intro creative writing class. I must have been 19, and it was phenomenal. He made us memorize the last line of Araby by James Joyce and stand and recite it, all this strange stuff. But he was kind, and he encouraged me to keep writing, and so then grad school. And in grad school, which I recommend if you want to expand your reading list, there was I learned of some great flash fiction writers, which I'll get to that in a second. I read some great fables by people like Amy Bender and Kelly Link, which are if you want to look at my book later, I'll just show you these names, but are really great. That women writers, they are fabulists, which means they write fables. Very funny, and it was a whole different kind of writing that I was used to. I was used to the Hemingway and the Faulkner, which is great. But which is different than these, what felt really vibrant, of people writing today and reading today, and young writers. So that was, in a nutshell, that's how I got to be here. I read a lot. These days I'm still reading a lot. These days I'm reading David Foster Wallace. I'm reading Beckett. I'm Vanessa Place, Ricky Dusernay. So lots of, these are way out wacky sort of writers, really, really interesting and funny. And something that struck me as I've grown as a reader and as a person, I suppose, is how much funny writing there is out there, and how exciting it is to discover that stuff. I'm often kind of, I'm considered a flash fiction writer, and I'm considered a humorist, and I'm considered a experimental writer. Which is to say a total hodgepodge, like my background, I think, which is about right. So let me explain to you what flash fiction is, in case you're unaware. flash fiction is a fancy new term that makes it sound like a new thing, but flash fiction has been around for a long time. They're just very short stories, usually under 600 words, but it can be as short as Hemingway has a good 6-word flash fiction story that you might know. It's For Sale, Baby Shoes Never Worn. And there's so much sad and hurt and world in that sentence. So that's the flash fiction is like a story or even a novel condensed into the smallest possible form. And why do we do that? Well, a lot of reasons. I think that the ideal way for a novel to be read is in one sitting, which is really hard if you have a job, or if you go to school, or if you have a life, I guess. But and if if a novel is 1,000 words or something. When I started reading Infinite Jest, I learned a trick actually that if I put earplugs in my ears, I could concentrate for about half an hour longer. It was funny and a recent revelation. But I had the earplugs in. I'm reading Infinite Jest for the first time, and I had the thought that I just want to sit and read this whole book in one sitting because it's an incredible, readable book. Very funny. Do try it. But and of course I had to go to the grocery store, so I had to take out the earplugs. But I do feel that a novel as a whole, in order to really feel the connections that the writer is trying to make, when a writer writes a book or a short story or a piece of flash fiction, they put an element in the beginning that comes up again later, and maybe twice, and maybe in a novel, 12 times or 20 times, sort of like when you're in a boat over the ocean and you see a fish, and then half an hour later you see the same fish, or is a different fish that looks similar to the fish, and you feel some recognition that I think is important to us as humans and as readers. And that's why reading a longer work feels really good. So to take something like that, like a novel, the best way to experience it is in one sitting, but what if you can't do that? And I think that's where short stories become really appealing and fun to read. You can sit down and read a short story and get the whole sense of the emotion and of the little fish swimming under the sea in just one sitting, and then you've read it, and you have it, and it'll stick with you. I think that's really interesting. And then you take a piece of flash fiction that's condensed down, and you still have those tiny little, even in the sound of a word that gets repeated, you get it to come back, or you get the cadence, or you get a little joke that returns once, maybe, or maybe twice. So in a theoretical way, I guess that's what makes flash fiction really cool to read. You can read it in 5 minutes or 10 minutes and sit there and take it in, and then maybe read it again. In the same way that you can read a poem in a sitting, but it's so much bigger than 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and you sit, or maybe you go on a walk, or tell somebody about it, or read it again. And that's what I really like about flash fiction. And although it's a new word, I suppose, maybe only a few decades old, flash fiction has been around for a pretty long time. If you think back to fables, you think back to the German Struwelpeter, Shock-Headed Peter. There's great fables. There's great Japanese fables. Any kind of like short sort of piece of Aesop, that kind of thing, where you get a lesson, or you get these animals that are talking, and then they teach you a lesson. And it's fun to read, and it's been around for such a long time. So flash fiction is that in a nutshell. Then you get something called prose poetry, which is different or the same, depending on your definition of either one. I like to think of prose poetry as something that doesn't need a narrative, meaning it doesn't necessarily need to have defined characters or resolution or a conflict necessarily. Maybe it does. But for me, the prose poetry I write, and I don't write it often, but when I do, the prose poetry is more language-centered, more interested in repeating words. I do a lot of run-on sentences. You get to forget about the constructs of grammar a little bit. Or I do anyway, in my definition of prose poetry. It's really fun. And mine end up looking like just a big paragraph, usually one character, usually thinking, very internal. So that's what I see as prose poetry. And then you take, there's another thing called vignettes, which can just be an exchange between two characters, or maybe half of a scene where somebody's looking at something and feeling something. I wrote, in my first book, AM/PM, I filled it with, there are flash fiction pieces, there's maybe one prose poem or two, and then there's a handful of vignettes where the characters who I've established are just talking to each other in a scene that I feel stands alone, sort of like a tiny chapter would stand alone, but is very close to flash fiction. People call it a book full of nothing but flash fiction, which is fine. People call it a novel, which is fine too. So in short, flash fiction, prose poetry, vignettes, short shorts they're called, or microfiction. Then you get into the definitions of things: novellas, novelettes, novels, and what are they? I don't know. It's important to not think about them too much, but that's the basic primer on what they are and what I do. So I think I'd like to read a little bit. I'll read two stories from Museum of the Weird. Let me see. The first one I'm going to read is called Trip Advisory, the Boyhood Home of Former President Ronald Reagan. Before you visit the boyhood home of former President Ronald Reagan, you should first note that there are, in actuality, many boyhood homes of former President Ronald Reagan. Choose wisely, and you will find yourself in the fully restored boyhood home that served as a boyhood home of former President Ronald Reagan from 1920 to 1923. It is located in Dixon, Illinois, home of the Petunia Festival. For the purposes of this report, think of the Dixon, Illinois home, where former President Ronald Reagan spent the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th years of his life, essential formative years, as the definitive boyhood home of former President Ronald Reagan, and therefore as the only boyhood home that will be discussed, though he was born above a bakery and surely felt on many occasions the wholesome heat of warm bread. Very little of the furniture, carpeting, foundation, and artifacts within the boyhood home of former President Ronald Reagan are original to the site. The reason for this is that old things smell terrible. Within the boyhood home of former President Ronald Reagan, you will find former President Ronald Reagan's fully restored boyhood bedroom, featuring items you might expect a 9, 10, 11, or 12-year-old boy to have owned between the years of 1920 and 1923. These items cycle seasonally within the home and could include baseball cards, autographed books, footballs, and wooden cup and ball toys. While former President Ronald Reagan never actually touched or considered these artifacts, you will be encouraged to observe and consider the objects in terms of their importance to our nation's history. Think, would former President Ronald Reagan have excelled at cup and ball, or would he have swung the toy around by its handle and launched it onto the roof? And how might those actions have later affected his Cold War policy? The importance of visiting the boyhood home of former President Ronald Reagan to your personal life is clear and unchallenged. Touring the home will give you a powerful feeling. You will realize that, in fact, we all had boyhood or girlhood homes, and that, though none of us were destined for the greatness that awaited 9-year-old Ronald Reagan, we all have a manner of greatness within us, untapped perhaps for many years, but held there in the heart like a secret. One part of the boyhood home of former President Ronald Reagan serves as a centerpiece to visitors and boyhood home employees. 4 pennies hidden in the spaces in the brick wall. Former President Ronald Reagan insisted on replacing the pennies at the final ceremonies for the restored boyhood home, and while he replaced the pennies, he told the lucky crowd in attendance that, as a child, he used to hide money in the bricks of that very wall. Of course, the wall was actually not original, but completely restored, and former President Ronald Reagan had in fact called ahead to order the workers to leave one brick loose so that he might tell the story and replace the pennies and please the crowd. The show was always of paramount importance to former President Ronald Reagan. And if visitors concentrate, they might be able to picture an 11-year-old Ronald Reagan hiding the pennies in the bricks of the wall and dreaming of the day that he might place different pennies in restored bricks put there especially for him so that he might tell the story. It should be noted that the 4 pennies in the brick within the boyhood home of former President Ronald Reagan are not the pennies that Ronald Reagan placed within the brick while telling the story at the final ceremonies for the restored boyhood home. The pennies are actually replica pennies, but are within view of the actual pennies former President Ronald Reagan used during the ceremony. The actual pennies are of great value and are mounted to a plaque over the mantle. The replica pennies, meanwhile, have their own worth beyond monetary value, for they act as a symbol of a very powerful symbol. Visitors are advised to take care in preparing for the boyhood home of former President Ronald Reagan. All are encouraged to wash their hands before touching doorknobs and rails, to wear shoes with soft soles, and to speak quietly and with reverence. Visitors are reminded to refrain from flash photography, to not carry in food or drink, and to take time to respect each orderly room of the boyhood home of former President Ronald Reagan, because it is integral to the history of the world, because it is sacred ground. Thank you. So that's one. It's a bit short. Yes. I think I'll read one more very short one. I'll read one more very short one after I talk for a second about experimental writing. So experimental writing is what I do, apparently, but I believe that anyone who sits down to write and has to look at that empty page and feel kind of terrified is performing an experiment of some kind. I think that even if you're writing what would be the most sellable novel, even if you're trying very hard to hit the top 10 bestseller list, which is fine. Even if you're trying to do that, you're still experimenting in some way. You're still trying to bring something different to the page, because if you write the same thing, they won't publish it, is the thing. But experimental writing, as it's known, for reasons because you have maybe animals talking to each other, or you have like a trip advisory, like I just read you, like a tour guide might say, was what I was hoping for that story. Or you might have a play that breaks out in the middle of the story, or a bulleted list, or a numbered list. That's why people call it experiment. You experiment with form, you experiment with characters, you experiment with pacing. The traditional way of writing a novel is rising, action, climax, denouement. But that's traditional in the sense that it's maybe, 400 years old, which is not very old in terms of humans, and not very old in terms of writing. And it turns out you get experimental writing back in, there's a Chinese novel called The Plum and the Golden Vase, 1590. It's apparently a hilarious experimental novel. There's a Greek writer named Chariton that was writing in the time of Christ and was writing apparently these romantic epics that are experimental and strange and different. And there's early Egyptian, early Assyrian novels that are more like Garcia Marquez than John Updike. I'm taking these lists from a book by someone named Stephen Moore. He wrote a book called The Novel and Alternate History, which is very interesting, if you're interested in the alternate history of the novel, and only then. But the traditional novel as we know it, the one that shoots to the top of the New York Times list for reasons that make sense, because it feels good to read a rising action, climax, denouement, for whatever that is. But those traditional novels are actually the strange ones. The experiment has been going on for a very long time, and I guess I say all this to mean that once you sit down at the page and find yourself saying, well, this doesn't feel like a novel. This feels like a paragraph kind of story, but it's really packed full of energy and excitement. You should do that. You should write that. And because you're following a long host of great writers who experimented before you. So that said, I'm going to read another short one. This is called Babies. Yeah, you're ready. One morning, I woke to discover I had given birth overnight. It was troubling to realize because I had felt no pain as I slept, did not remember the birth, and in fact, had not even known I was pregnant. But there he was, a little baby boy, swaddled among cotton sheets, sticky with amniotic fluid and other various baby goops. The child had pulled himself up to my breast in the night and was at that moment having breakfast. He looked up and smiled when I reached for him. "Hello," I said. I bundled my sheets and my mattress pad into a trash bag and set it by the door. I got into the shower with my new baby because we were both covered in the material of his birth and were becoming cold. I soaped him up with my gentle face soap. He laughed and I laughed because using face soap on an infant is funny. I toweled him off and wrapped him in a linen shirt. On the walk to the store, I called my boyfriend, Chuck. "I had a baby overnight," I said. Chuck coughed. "I am not amenable to babies," he said. I looked down at the baby. He was bundled up in the fine shirt and smiled as if he were aware of the quality of the shirt and enjoyed it. "I am in love with this baby," I said, and that's that. At the grocery, I bought baby powder, diapers, 2 pacifiers, and a box of chocolate. I walked us home, fit a diaper on the baby, and ate a piece of chocolate. Chuck came over and said that perhaps he was amenable to babies after all, and we fell asleep together with the baby between us. The baby had not cried all day, and neither had I. The next morning, we woke to discover I had once again given birth, this time to a little girl. The babies were nestled together between us on the bed, and my spare sheets were ruined. I handed the babies off to Chuck and sent him to the shower. I bundled up the spare sheets and placed them by the other bag of sheets. Then I got into the shower with Chuck. It was a nervous fit with the 2 of us and the babies. "These babies are so quiet," said Chuck. "I love them too. But I hope you don't have another one overnight." We all had a good laugh. The next morning, there was another baby, and another, and another, and another. And that brings us to today. Thanks. So I think I might take some questions. All right. Questions from the audience time. Yes.
As a young writer, how do you balance being able to make a living, make the time and effort it takes to build a writing career?
Fantastic question. I was gonna talk about that, so that's perfect. Well, I work as a marketing writer. I work from home. I write articles about online education, and I write articles about home improvement, and I write a great weekly column about celebrity home remodeling. That's you should check it out. I write it under a pseudonym, so it's going to be hard. But so I write for this company that's in Reno, and I'm in Austin, so I don't have to go to the office, which is great. They're very good to me, and it's a way that I can basically stay home all day in my pajamas if I need to, which I often need to, and work or not work, which I think is essential for the creative process. It's very hard, I don't know if you've noticed, but to say now is the time I'm going to write a story, and to sit down, you finally made time with school or work or kids or life, and you're like, now I have to do it, or maybe there's a deadline or you have a class to do it for. That never works, or it doesn't work well. So it's best for me anyway to have a job where I can be writing fiction in the morning, which is what I usually like to do, and then have coffee and then write for work. I write a lot. I write about 10,000 words a week for work, which is kind of a heavy workload, but it allows me to stay home and write and send things to publishers and wait and enter contests and wait. And that works pretty well for me. Yes?
How does Gertrude Stein in the realm of science fiction?
She does. That's great. Great question. I'd say she's more on the prose poetry side, just because she takes it out of character so often and puts it just into words, like sentences, interrogative or declarative, and is so funny. And Tender Buttons was one of my favorites books of gosh, I guess 2005. And she, in short, I guess she's an inspiration for the people that have come beyond her to say, well, okay, how can you take a story and take its characters out, or how can you take a poem and break its lines, and what happens then? I have a story the last story in this book, I think, is my sort of Stein ode. It's called The Movement, and it's more declarative sentence than it is rising action.
Do you think she was aware of the fact that she was a flash fiction writer?
Oh gosh, I think she was aware of the fact that she was everything. I think she would like it if someone said that to her. But she might argue it. I think she was pretty stone cold poet, which is fine. I think it's harder to be a poet. Yeah, back there.
Do you ever have a desire to write something longer, like Infinite Jest, or
Well, I just finished a novel, so I guess yes. I mean, a draft of a novel is very, I don't know, strike that. But yeah, I do. When I started to write something longer, it was sort of in the guise of writing very short chapters, like they were individual pieces of flash fiction or individual short stories, but linking them together with a character and an action. In the past, I wrote a novel in college when I was a sophomore in college, that was not very good. But it was a really great experience to write it, to sit down. It was for National Novel Writing Month, which is in November. And I did it in 37 words a day or whatever it is, and wrote that thing. But it felt really good to try. But this time around, I actually sat down and wrote a story that got bigger, which is, I found, the best way to write a novel. It's very hard to sit down and say, I would like to write Infinite Jest. Within now and the next 4 years, I'll just do that. It's much better in my experience, to sit down and find a character that you really love, or a situation that intrigues you enough to follow it for however long you have to. So yeah. Yeah. No, I don't. It was perfect for the time, though. Man, it was perfect. I was a music major and a journalism major, and I didn't like either of it, and I didn't know what to do, and I had this terrible job as a computer lab sitter. I wanted to be a computer programmer, so I was living in sort of cloud, and it was like, oh, every day you write this, and this is real, and then you're going to come out with something that's real. Like, great, okay, I'll do that. And it taught me about characters and dialogue and pacing, and then the novel that came out of it was really crummy in my case, but I've heard that people have better luck with it. But yeah, I think about it, I observe it, but in the same way that I observe a child walking down the street. You know what I mean? Yeah.
You mentioned Ballagher and Shirley Jackson, and Ballagher is a manager. I've read 9 stories.
Mm-hmm.
And also Shirley Jackson just recently with the lottery and other short stories.
Yeah.
When it comes to short stories, do you like to read first, or maybe both? I don't know, but like with Ballagher, they're kind of more realistic short stories in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
With Shirley Jackson, it's more like kind of a mystical, odd, kind of Albert Lincoln type deal.
Yeah.
For you, do you prefer one over the other, or kind of just you like either both styles?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good observation, because it really is the opposite sides of the scale. There's the super real Salinger, and the really out there Shirley Jackson. And if you think the lottery is out there, there's a collection called Just an Ordinary Day of her stories she wrote when she was younger, and uncollected, and some of those are very, very weird. They're great, though. I love realism. I love realists, and I love reading them. I think that my stories are very real in the sense that vultures exist, and people have suitcases, and sometimes they eat hair. That's a thing that actually happens. But yeah, I like to bridge the gap in my writing, I suppose, and definitely in my reading. I will read the heck out of some Raymond Carver, but I also really love your Shirley Jackson. There's another great writer, Gary Lutz. If you like Shirley Jackson, you might like Gary Lutz. That kind of fuse reality and whatever else, and sometimes that science fiction-y aspect is very cool too. So, short answer is yeah, I like to read it all, and I think it finds its way in my writing, which is fine. Yeah.
You find that your nonfiction writing for marketing and for the internet, does that help you become a better writer and help you with your fiction writing, or are the two so totally different? I think we have a lot of young writers here, so you want to get them writing. Everybody wants to write glamorous stuff. I will.
Yeah.
There's nitty-gritty stuff that helps you become a writer.
Oh yeah, of course. I was really worried when I moved. I was writing maybe 1,000 or 2,000 words a week for those guys, and then I moved up to 8, and then I moved up to 10. I was really concerned that it would kill my writing, but it helped immensely. It helps you think about the way a sentence should be structured. It helps you think about commas in a really unromantic way, about pacing, about first lines and last lines. And I think most importantly for me, it takes a little bit of the romantic aspect out of writing, which I think I've written the worst stories when I think now is the time that I will write a fantastic story about XYZ. This is personally. But when I have an idea in my head that I can't shake, and I've written my money words all day, and I have to write this story, that's when it comes out really clean, I think, and without all of the nervousness of like, oh God, I hope this is a good story, and if this is good, then maybe I'll try to send it to this journal that I really love. The less I think about that stuff, then the more I can just write, because I've been writing all day, is really good for me. And then there's those mechanics things, and the trying to say something new. Like I've been writing 500-word articles about why you should get a master's degree in psychology for the past 5 years. Like the same 500-word article, but just different so that Google knows it's not a machine writing it. Like, that's depressing. But what's cool about that is that you really start thinking about how can a sentence be worded differently, how can a word be different. You have to expand your vocabulary a little bit, but all within keeping it within the range of this word level. So I don't know, it's fantastic for me, and it's fantastic it feels so good to write and get a paycheck no matter what the words are, for me. So encouraged. And the internet is so growing, it's so huge and building and growing that I think it's going to become even easier to get these weird little writing jobs, writing for people's websites. And so if you're a young writer, or even if you're not and you're looking for an extra paycheck, look into this internet writing thing. It's a really good idea. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do. Moving to Texas was a big thing. It's kind of, I found it's important to get out of what you know every day and see something different. I take a lot of road trips, and I get some stories from that. I wrote a story about Beaumont, Texas, when I drove through Beaumont. Beautiful Beaumont. And there's a snake farm outside of San Marcos, Texas, with this huge hand-painted sign, this beautiful sign that says Snake Farm in red, and there's little snakes curling around it. It is so weird. And of course I had to write a story about that strange sign, and who would paint that sign, and who lives in that world, and who gets really excited about owning a snake farm. And in my opinion, it's kind of a weird guy. And little things, little conversations can start a story, little snippets of ideas. I write stories sometimes as jokes. There's one about a trick au bezoar. There's a disease where you pull out your hair and you eat it, which it's a compulsion thing, like a lot of compulsions. But sometimes people eat metal or little parts of things. Sometimes people eat hair. And I wrote a story about a girl who would do that. Just reading off of a CNN article I found and looking at this picture, and you know, and the article is really sensational and it's trying to gross you out, and it's just whatever. It's because it's a 3-pound thing of hair that they dug out of her, which is gross. But when I was writing that story, I wanted to write about someone who is completely like this is an ordinary, normal thing, because it is. That's what fascinates me. It's there's so much weird in the world that's normal, and there's so much normal in the world that's really weird. And I really like and I really like bridging the divide between those two ideas. Yeah.
When you actually are a kid, I mean, what can you do? Because all the other people, they can say, oh, what a cute little kid. I guess I can like this story. I mean, it's cute.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. That is a really frustrating time of life when people are like, oh, you're cute, that's a good, I guess that's okay. It's terrible. No, I'm serious. It's horrible. And you'll feel that for a while. But I would suggest finding a community, even if it's like your friend who writes too, who takes you seriously. Yep, friends. That's good. That's step 1. That's step 1 through 5 of finding a friend who takes you seriously. I had to do that in grad school. It took me a long time. But I would say there are communities out there for young writers. There are magazines for young writers where it's less of a like, oh, look at this great thing, and it's more of a serious thing. Like your stories get taken serious. Failing that, just enter it in some contests. There's no age limit. And then just win it and be like, well, I won that $500 contest, so I guess I'm a pretty good writer. Yeah, there's that. In the meantime, you join writing groups and meet people who are like-minded. It's like that for everybody. You get that you get that on the other side too. You get older writers who say, well, now nobody takes my writing seriously because they're like, oh, great, well, Grandma wrote a story, fantastic. But it happens. It's tragic because there are some fantastic stories out there, and you just have to find like-minded people who say, that's a fantastic story you just wrote, good job. That's important. That's a great question. One more question? Okay.
What do you do when you're not tired of your writing? You sound like you
Well, I do get tired of it. There's a lot of failed stories on my hard drive. There's a lot, and a novel, and 2 novels, and I forgot about that one, but yeah, that's there too. I would just don't worry about getting tired of it, because you do. There are times when you're writing. When I was writing this latest thing, it was between something like 19,000 words and 24,000 words, and I was like, I am the biggest loser on the face of the earth. I'm an idiot, and I'm a bad writer, and you can quote me on that. And that's just how it feels to write a novel when you're trying to slog through it, when the excitement of the new character has worn off, and you're like, oh, I have to keep writing until I hit 50,000 words. This is terrible. Why did I sign up for this? And so it sort of goes along with what I was saying a bit earlier about taking the romantic side out of writing. It's so hard because when you think of it romantically, that's when you say, oh, and I'm so horrible. I'll never do this right. When you make it really just work that you do, that it's just sort of business because it's your job. Call it volunteer work maybe, but when it's your job, then you say, okay, I had a kind of a crummy day at the office, but it was okay. I figured out that this character is thinking about this. I'm going to come back to it later. You have a bad day, or you have a bad week, or a bad month, or a bad year with writing. Even that just happens. Because that's how a job is. That's how writing is too. One more? Oh. One more.
How do young writers find out about writing contests?
Okay, yeah, good. There's a great website called htmlgiant.com that they talk a lot about great journals in addition to great contests. When a press is opening for submissions, they'll say that. htmlgiant.com. It's writing down? That's good. It's a great site, and it's a great resource. There's communities like that are good. That's really the big one that I look at now. There's a website called Duotrope, Duotrope. Giant. Yeah. Duotrope, which is a database of magazines. If you're looking for young writer magazines, if you're looking for older stuff, you're looking for sci-fi journals, that's a great resource too. It'll talk about contests. For a while I was looking at the back of Poets and Writers because they list contests. And then you find out about these journals, you sign up for their newsletters, and then they let you know. I'd say most of all, find a journal you love to read. There's great ones online. One called Diagram is one of my favorite journals. They have a summer fiction. They're usually poetry and prose poetry, but they do a summer fiction that is the best fiction issue of any journal, I believe. And it's online for free. So Diagram. So stuff like that. And then as you read more, then you say, oh, then they're having a contest. This journal I love is doing a prize, and that thing, it just builds. Okay, one more little. Yeah.
We wanted to know.
Don't pull her into it.
How old were you when you started writing, not necessarily professionally?
I was writing stories just to try out the typewriter when I was 6 and 7, but I wrote my first, what I would call a story, when I was a senior in high school. Really old, I think. And then didn't get into it until college. Oh, I did write a science fiction novel, though. I'm remembering all these things. I wrote a science fiction thing on the computer right when we first got the computer, which must have been about 10 or 11. And I just liked science fiction at the time, and I still do. So yeah, I say whenever you come to writing, that's a good time. That's my opinion. That's the last word on that.